By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific Ocean had become a graveyard of imperial ambitions. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once an indomitable force that had swept across the horizon with the arrogance of a rising sun, was now a fractured shadow of its former self. The industrial might of the United States had not just met the Japanese challenge, it had overwhelmed it with a tidal wave of steel, oil, and fire. For the planners in Tokyo, the situation was no longer about winning the war, but about finding a meaningful way to die. The strategic landscape was dominated by the American invasion of the Philippines. If the islands fell, the lifeblood of the empire, the oil routes from the East Indies, would be severed forever. Without fuel, the Japanese fleet would be nothing more than expensive pier decorations. This realization birthed the Sho-Go I plan, a desperate, multi-pronged gamble that relied on deception, sacrifice, and a level of coordination that the Japanese military was no longer capable of achieving. The systemic failure of the Japanese high command began with a fundamental disconnect between their tactical goals and their logistical reality. They envisioned a decisive battle, a singular clash of titans that would turn the tide of the war in one afternoon. However, they were planning for a type of warfare that had already been rendered obsolete by the very carriers they had pioneered at Pearl Harbor. The battleship, once the undisputed king of the seas, was now a vulnerable relic in an age of naval aviation. The plan itself was a masterpiece of complexity and a recipe for disaster. It involved four separate forces moving from different directions to converge on Leyte Gulf. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would lead the northern force, acting as the sacrificial lamb. His carriers, largely stripped of their aircraft and experienced pilots, were tasked with luring Admiral William and Bull Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the invasion beaches. It was a suicide mission designed to create a window of opportunity for the heavy guns of the surface fleet. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Tokeo Kurita would lead the center force, a formidable collection of battleships and cruisers, including the twin behemoths Yamato and Musashi. They were to punch through the Sibuyan Sea and descend upon the American landing craft. Simultaneously, two other forces would approach through the Surigao Strait. The success of this operation required every gear in the machine to turn in perfect synchronization, yet the Japanese lacked the radar, the communications, and the air cover to ensure even the simplest maneuver. The first cracks in the plan appeared on October 23 in the dark waters of the Palawan Passage. Two American submarines, the Data and the Dace, intercepted Kurita's center force. In a matter of minutes, the Japanese flagship Atago and her sister ship Maya were sent to the bottom, while the Takao was crippled. Kurita himself was forced to swim for his life before being hauled aboard the Yamato. The psychological impact of this ambush before the main engagement even began was profound. The sense of being watched by an invisible, omnipresent enemy began to erode the confidence of the Japanese commanders. On October 24, the battle shifted to the Sibuyan Sea. American carrier pilots, launched from the task forces of the Third Fleet, located Kurita's regrouped force. What followed was one of the most intense aerial bombardments in naval history. The primary target was the Musashi, a ship designed to withstand more punishment than any vessel ever built. She was a mountain of steel, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, yet she was defenseless against the relentless, coordinated strikes of Helldivers and Avengers. For hours, the Musashi took hit after hit. Torpedoes tore into her hull, and bombs shredded her superstructure. The ship's captain, Rear Admiral Toshihiro Inaguchi, attempted to use the ship's massive 18-inch guns to fire beehive shells into the air, creating a wall of fire to deter the American pilots. It was a spectacle of futility. The Musashi was being dismantled by 1,000 cuts. By evening, the pride of the Imperial Navy capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. The loss of the Musashi was a systemic shock. If the most powerful battleship in the world could be destroyed without ever seeing an enemy ship, the entire Japanese naval doctrine was a lie. Kurita, shaken by the carnage and fearing his entire force would be wiped out before reaching Leyte, briefly turned his fleet around. This momentary retreat convinced Admiral Halsey that the center force was no longer a threat. Halsey, true to his aggressive nature, took the bait offered by Ozawa's northern force and steamed north with his entire fleet, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. This tactical error by Halsey set the stage for the most lopsided and heroic engagement of the war, the Battle off Samar. On the morning of October 25, Admiral Kurita's center force, having turned back toward Leyte under the cover of night, emerged from the San Bernardino Strait. Expecting to find the heavy hitters of the American Third Fleet, they instead found Taffy 3 a small unit of escort carriers and destroyers tasked with supporting the ground troops. The disparity in power was comical, if not for the lethal stakes. Kurita had 4 battleships, including the Yamato, and 6 heavy cruisers. Taffy 3 had 6 jeep carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The Japanese shells were larger than the American ships they were targeting. To the American sailors, the sight of Japanese pagodas on the horizon was a death sentence. Yet, what followed was a display of sheer, unadulterated defiance that defied military logic. The unsung heroes of this engagement were the crews of the small boys the destroyers Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts. Under the command of men like Ernest E. Evans, the Johnston did not retreat. It charged. Evans, a man of Cherokee and Creek heritage, knew the odds were 0, but he ordered his ship into a torpedo run against the Japanese heavy cruisers. The Johnston wove through a forest of splashes, her 5-inch guns barking at giants. The Samuel B. Roberts, a ship nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship followed suit. Her crew pushed their engines far beyond their rated capacity, charging into point-blank range to fire their torpedoes and guns. The American pilots from the escort carriers joined the fray, attacking the Japanese fleet with whatever they had, torpedoes, depth charges, and even practice bombs. Some pilots made dry runs just to distract the Japanese gunners, flying through walls of flak to buy time for the transports in the Gulf. In the chaos, the Japanese commanders became convinced they were fighting the main American fleet. The ferocity of the American defense, combined with the confusing signals and the smoke screens, led Kurita to believe he was being surrounded by superior forces. The legendary mystery turn occurred when Kurita, within reach of the defenseless invasion fleet, ordered a retreat. He had lost his nerve, broken by the suicidal bravery of a handful of sailors in small ships. While the drama unfolded off Samar, another tragedy was playing out to the south in the Sho-Go Strait. This was the last great battleship duel in history. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force sailed directly into a meticulously prepared trap set by Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. The Americans had crossed the T, a classic naval maneuver that allowed them to bring all their broadsides to bear on the approaching Japanese line, which could only fire its forward guns. The Japanese ships were decimated by a wall of radar-directed fire. The battleship Fuso was blown in 2, and the Yamashiro was hammered into a burning wreck. It was a mechanical, almost industrial slaughter. Unlike the chaotic melee off Samar, the Battle of Sho-Go Strait was a demonstration of the absolute superiority of American technology and tactical positioning. Nishimura went down with his ship, a victim of a plan that required him to sail into a literal dead end. By the end of October 25, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as a functional fighting force. They had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and thousands of irreplaceable sailors and pilots. The Sho-Go plan had succeeded in its deception, but failed in its execution because the Japanese could not fathom the resilience and initiative of the lower-tier American commanders. The small boys of Taffy 3 had achieved what Halsey's mighty fleet was supposed to do, through nothing but raw courage and a refusal to accept the inevitable. The aftermath of Leyte Gulf was a somber realization of the changing nature of power. The era of the battleship was buried in the Philippine seas. The Japanese had built the most magnificent vessels of the dreadnought age, only to find that the world had moved on to a more impersonal, distant form of destruction. The Musashi and Yamato were symbols of an empire that excelled at the aesthetics of war but failed at the science of it. The historical irony of Leyte Gulf lies in the fact that the Japanese sacrifice was for a cause that was already lost. The all they sought to protect was already unreachable. The decisive battle they craved only served to accelerate their own annihilation. It was a clash of two different centuries, the 19th century romanticism of a warrior's death meeting the 20th century reality of total, industrial attrition. In the end, the story of the Japanese Navy's demise is not just one of tactical errors or technological gaps. It is a story of systemic hubris. The belief that spirit could overcome steel, that a complex plan could replace clear communication, and that the sacrifice of thousands could stop the momentum of a nation that had fully mobilized its soul. The waters of Leyte Gulf remain silent now, but they hold the wreckage of a navy that once thought it could own the world, only to be consumed by its own obsession with a glorious end. The ghosts of the Johnston and the Samuel Bede Roberts still patrol those depths in the memory of history, reminding us that in the face of overwhelming odds, the individual's choice to stand and fight is the only thing that truly matters. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not just die at Leyte Gulf, it was dismantled by the very modernity it tried to conquer. The sun had finally set, and in the darkness that followed, the world saw the true cost of an empire built on the vanity of the superweapon and the disregard for the human cost of war. As the waves settle over the final resting places of the Musashi and her sisters, we are left with the chilling philosophical takeaway of the Pacific War. Greatness is not measured by the size of one and Appo's guns or the thickness of one and Appo's armor, but by the clarity of one and Appo's purpose and the truth of one and Appo's reality. The Japanese Navy sailed into the fog of its own myths and never returned. The ocean, vast and indifferent, simply swallowed the remains of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. The tragedy of the Imperial Navy was its inability to evolve. It clung to the sword while the world embraced the shield and the lightning. In the final accounting, the Battle of Leyte Gulf stands as a monument to the end of an era, a chaotic, fire-drenched transition into a new world where the giants of the past were no match for the relentless spirit of the future. The sea has claimed the steel, but the lessons of that catastrophic failure remain, echoing through the halls of history like the distant thunder of 18-inch guns falling silent forever.